At 5 with the latest for Herefordshire and Worcestershire, I'm Gavin Kermack. A public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal of the 1970s and 80s has heard that those affected have lived through the worst of times. Final evidence has been given today. An estimated 30,000 people were infected with HIV and hepatitis in what's been described as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. When the inquiry started in 2019, a number of people from Worcestershire were among those affected, giving testimonies. Colin Smith's son died at the age of 7 after being infected during his treatment for a blood condition.
It's the only recompense we're going to get, because nobody's going to be able to account for this. They're politicians, they'll find a way around it. It's been a 30-odd year struggle. But yes, I'm not ashamed of the fact that it ruined our lives. It cost me my job. We've had to move home. It's cost us lots of relationships with friends.
Now, a long-running public inquiry into what has been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS will hear its final evidence today. It's thought tens of thousands were infected with HIV and hepatitis between 1970 and 1991 after being given a contaminated drug or blood transfusion. Researchers found that 380 of those infected with HIV, that's about 1 in 3, were children, including some very young toddlers. The inquiry, which started in 2018, has reviewed thousands of documents and heard testimony from 370 witnesses and led to interim compensation payments of £100,000 for survivors and widows. One of the key questions the inquiry will now have to answer is whether more could and should have been done to prevent those infections and deaths. Let's speak now to two people who've been affected by this. Colette Wintle from Martley and Andy Evans from Evesham. He's also chair of the Tainted Blood campaign group. Good evening, both.
Hi there.
Good evening. Hi.
Colette, if we can start with you first. Tell us what happened to you.
Well, it began in 1976 when I was still considered a child at the age of 17, and I was known as a haemophilia carrier, but also asymptomatic of the condition. And I'd gone in for a routine surgery and ended up being treated post-bleeding with what I now know to be commercial blood products, which came from, they were sourced from Louisiana jails. But I didn't find that information out until some 26 years later. But I was further infected at 2 other hospitals in England, with hepatitis B, and then attacked again with hepatitis C. I was very lucky that I avoided AIDS, particularly the last infection, because it was done at a hospital in North London in 1985, after the AIDS crisis had hit, and when blood products should have been removed from the shelves many years before. So it's devastated my life, as you can well imagine, and the impact has been multifaceted. And that's effectively, what has happened. And I've spent the last best part of 30 years campaigning for justice with government after government, avoiding answering the questions that were being asked of them. And, I have to say that, many of the documents that have informed this inquiry were presented by myself and my campaign colleague Carol Grayston well over 20 years ago, and we challenged minister after minister with the information, and were blocked repeatedly and refused, the ability to sit down and have a proper conversation. It's been an absolute scandal.
I don't have words for this, but from what you tell me, anger, frustration, I'm sure, so many emotions. And I'm wondering, you all have been around many people affected by this today, Colette. What was the atmosphere like amongst you all?
Very emotional. For many, it was cathartic that, they were being heard, that the information was finally being presented in an official manner. For myself, I have a deep mistrust of government and all that they represent and have been over the years. So I don't personally feel that it's at an end for me. I will not feel that, and I will not feel peace as was being hoped for and presented by my KC Sam Steen today, the desire for hope and peace for everybody, that we can have a life after this. I won't feel that until government finally hold their hands up and accept that wrongdoing was done. They know perfectly well it was done. And why they couldn't have admitted, as far back as I was a core participant to the Archer inquiry, why they couldn't at that point have said, OK, let's do what the Republic of Ireland have done. We'll hold our hands up and say, but without admission of liability, that, we accept that you have suffered extreme harm and suffering, and therefore we will pay you. And I have cousins in Ireland who benefited from that, but not myself. I have spent decades battling government for justice, and it goes on.
So after the conclusions of the inquiry are published this summer, is that what you're looking for, an official apology and hands up to this?
Absolutely, because, we had an apology from David Cameron in 2015. We had a further apology in 2018, and government effectively destroyed the goodwill of those apologies by their KC in the last 2 weeks saying to Sir Brian, the chair of the inquiry, that they couldn't quantify what they were apologising for, even though David Cameron had said, we know that things went wrong, things, happened that shouldn't have happened. Now they will no longer qualify what that means. Wow. And that is insulting to the many, many victims who've suffered. And I speak as a member of the Hemophilia community whom I've campaigned for years, that for us, that is the worst insult and actually has caused us all further trauma because we know it was lip service, it was meaningless. And I don't know how they had the gall to send their KC to say that. It's disgusting.
Colette, thank you. I hear your anger and your frustration. I'd like to bring Andy in here. Again, briefly, Andy, tell us how you've been affected by this scandal.
Hi, Tammy. Yeah, I was infected when I was 5 with my haemophilia blood products. They'd recently moved me from a safer product called cryoprecipitate to commercial factor 8 products, which were brought in from America. Those had been sourced from donors who were being paid for their blood. So the very basics of this scandal is that these products were pulled from thousands of donors, only one of which had to be infected with something in order to infect the entire batch, which is why so many haemophiliacs were infected. Pretty much 100% of haemophiliacs were infected with hepatitis C, and a good many of those, like myself, with HIV as well. Of the HIV victims, around about 1,200 of us, there are only around 200 alive today.
Oh, goodness.
So it's absolutely decimated our communities. And thousands more, obviously, still suffering with the effects of this. Myself, I was only just saved in the nick of time as a teenager from full-blown AIDS when the new combination therapies came out. But as you can imagine, that's had a huge impact on my life and has taken, I'm 45 now. It's 40 years in the making for me. So it's been a long old stretch to get to the point that we are today.
The fact that this happened to you at the age of 5, and similarly, as we heard with Colette, when these things happen, that on top of the impact it's had on your physical health, that the fight that's been all pervasive on your mental health, and consequently that cycle continues because physically you're impacted by what's going on mentally. I can't even begin to imagine the struggle, Andy, and indeed for Colette. Andy, what are you hoping this inquiry will achieve?
We've always said, really, that there have been 2 scandals here. First was the original infection, the decisions that were made around that. And the second is the fight that we've had to put up for, getting on for sort of 3 decades of campaigning now. I think what I personally would like to get out of it is some vindication for the fact that we've had to dedicate our lives to campaigning for this and being blocked so forcefully and repeatedly by various governments who do not want to get to the truth because they know full well that there'll be culpability there. But I'd also like recognition for all of those people that have gone before. Our campaign group, Tainted Blood, was set up in 2006 off the back of many others that had gone before, including Colette and Carol that went before, Birch Grove Group, which was set up for HIV patients, the Manor House Group set up for hepatitis C patients. So many campaigns have gone before this. I'd really like those people to be recognised for what they did, even though many of them are no longer with us anymore.
Sure. And you've continued that fight against all odds. And really, frankly, I can imagine that you're nothing short of exhausted. I thank you for sharing, and we will continue, obviously, to follow the outcomes of this when the conclusions of the inquiry are published this summer. But we do appreciate your time, Andy, and indeed you, Colette. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah,
thank you, Tammy.
Very much. And we appreciate you following it, because it's the worst disaster in terms of an NHS treatment, and particularly, as Andy said, our community of nearly 5,000 were infected during the 70s and 80s, and I think there might, if I'm right, Andy, there's well over 3,000 are dead. There might be 1,500 of us left alive, and believe me, we are struggling and exhausted, and we just simply want justice. That is it in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you both. Sending all good wishes your way. Thank you so much. Colette Wintle and Andy Evans from Worcestershire, both victims of the Contaminated Blood scandal. And what a story, what a situation, and what a life, what a fight they're having to continue to fight. And we'll continue to follow that story right here at BBC Hereford and Worcester.